The transit deck of the GSV Wandering Cradle smelled like sweat, engine grease, and 100 different species who had not bathed in days. It was loud. It was hot. And there were far too many bodies packed into a space that was never built for this many passengers. Eli Voss sat in one of the few remaining bolted-down seats near the far wall. His eyes were barely open. His hands rested on his knees, and both of them were wrapped in cheap medical tape that was already peeling at the edges. Underneath the tape, his skin was red and raw from 14 hours of fixing a coolant relay deep in the belly of the ship. The relay had been leaking for weeks. Nobody else wanted to touch it because the access tunnel was too narrow and too hot for most species. But Eli was human, and humans were small, and the ship needed the relay fixed. So he fixed it. Now he just wanted to close his eyes for a few minutes. Around him, the transit deck was a mess of noise and movement. A group of Bravani merchants argued over cargo space in the corner. 2 Torvali soldiers stood near the main door with their arms crossed, watching everyone with cold, compound eyes. A family of Kolvari, small 4-armed amphibians, huddled together on the floor near the water dispenser, trying to stay out of everyone's way. Eli's friend Zet was one of them. He sat a few feet away, his damp green skin glistening under the overhead lights. He was nervous. Zet was always nervous. 3 more days, Zet muttered. 3 more days, to Valon, and then I am never getting on this ship again. Eli grunted. He did not have the energy for words. Then the door at the far end of the deck slid open, and everything changed. She had to duck to get through the doorway. That was the first thing Eli noticed. The second thing he noticed was that she was hurt. The Draconeth was tall, over 8 feet, with scales the color of burned charcoal. But the scales were wrong. They were cracked in places, flaking at the edges, dull where they should have been shining. Her eyes, which should have glowed like hot coals, were dim and tired. She walked with a limp, her left leg dragging slightly with each step. One of her clawed hands pressed against the wall for balance. The transit deck went quiet. Not silent. The noise didn't stop completely, but the energy shifted. People looked up, then looked away. A Bravani merchant pulled his cargo crate closer to his body, filling the gap beside him. A pair of Kolvari scrambled to the other side of the room. The Torvali soldiers stiffened, but did not move. Nobody offered help. Nobody said a word. Eli watched her move through the deck. She was looking for somewhere to sit, or even somewhere to lean. But every corner was taken. Every wall was blocked. And everywhere she looked, people turned away from her. Because a Draconeth showing weakness made them uncomfortable. In the Galactic Cooperative, the Draconeth were legends, fire-breathing warriors, conquerors, rulers of 60 star systems in their prime. Seeing one like this was like watching a mountain crumble. People did not want to be near it when it fell. She reached the middle of the deck and stopped. There was nowhere left to go. Her breathing was heavy and rough, like something inside her chest was broken. She stood there, surrounded by hundreds of beings, completely alone. Eli looked at her. Then he looked at his seat. Then he looked at his burned hands, and his aching back, and his tired legs that had been standing for most of the last 14 hours. He stood up. He picked up his toolkit from the floor, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped away from the seat. Then he looked at the Draconeth, and gestured toward the empty spot with a small nod of his head. She stared at him. Her dim ember eyes studied his face with an expression he could not read. Confusion, maybe. Suspicion, probably. Among her people, a lesser species giving way to a Draconeth was a sign of submission, an acknowledgement that you were beneath them. But there was nothing submissive in Eli's eyes. He was not bowing. He was not afraid. He was just a tired man offering his seat to someone who looked like she needed it more than he did. The moment stretched. The nearby passengers watched in silence. Then slowly, she lowered herself into the seat. Her body sagged with relief as the weight came off her injured leg. She let out a long breath that sounded like steam escaping a cracked pipe. Eli nodded once, turned, and walked toward the nearest wall. He found a spot between a support beam and a ventilation grate, leaned his back against the cold metal, and closed his eyes. Zet appeared beside him almost immediately. His forearms were waving in the way they always did when he was upset. "You just gave your seat to a Draconeth," Zet whispered. "Are you trying to get yourself killed or adopted?" "She needed it," Eli said without opening his eyes. "She is a Draconeth. They do not need things from humans. They eat things from humans." "She was limping, Zet." "Many things limp. That does not mean you give them your chair." Eli did not answer, half asleep, his head resting against the support beam, his toolkit clutched against his chest like a pillow. Across the deck, Saratha Kelvane watched the humans settle against the wall. She watched the way he simply closed his eyes and accepted the discomfort without complaint. She watched his small friend fuss over him, and she watched him ignore it. Nobody had shown her a kindness without wanting something in return for over 2 years. Not since her exile. Not since she refused the order that ended her career and her place among her people. For 2 years, she had moved through the galaxy like a ghost. Too proud to beg, too weak to fight, too stubborn to die. And now a human mechanic, with burned hands and oil on his face, had given her his seat. Not because she was Draconeth, not because he was afraid, just because she was tired and he could see it. She did not know what to do with that. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she slept. Somewhere beneath them, deep in the guts of the ship, a metal groan echoed through the hull. The wandering cradle shuddered, just slightly, just for a moment. Most passengers did not even notice. But Eli's eyes opened. His hand pressed flat against the wall behind him. He felt the vibration in the metal, the faint tremor that ran through the ship's bones like a warning. Something was wrong. He frowned, stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then closed his eyes again. It was probably nothing. Someone else would handle it. 3 decks below, a crack spread silently through the FTL containment matrix, and the clock started ticking. 8 hours later, the universe came apart. Eli was half asleep against his wall when the first explosion hit. It was not loud in the way people expected explosions to be. It was deep, a sound that came up through the floor and into his bones before it reached his ears. The entire ship lurched sideways. The lights went out. Then came the screaming. Emergency red lighting kicked in a few seconds later, painting everything in blood-colored shadows. The transit deck was chaos. Bodies tumbled across the floor. Cargo crates slid and crashed into walls. The artificial gravity stuttered. For one terrible second, everyone floated, and then they slammed back down as the backup systems caught them. Alarms screamed from every speaker. A mechanical voice repeated the same words over and over. Hull breach detected. Decks 7, 9, and 12. All passengers remain in place. Emergency protocols active. Eli was on his feet before the voice finished its first loop. His toolkit was already in his hand. Around him, passengers were scrambling, shoving, crying. The Torvali soldiers were shouting orders that nobody was listening to. The Bravani merchants were trying to drag their cargo toward the exits. Then the bulkhead doors came down. They dropped like guillotine blades, massive slabs of reinforced steel slamming into the floor with a sound that ended all other sounds. The transit deck was cut into sealed sections in an instant. Eli found himself on the wrong side of the divide, trapped in a lower section of the deck with roughly 40 other passengers. Jet was there, thank God. The little Kolvari had been standing near Eli when the doors came down, and now he was pressed against his friend's leg, all 4 arms wrapped around Eli's knee, shaking so hard his skin was rippling. She sat in the same seat Eli had given her, gripping the armrests with clawed hands, her dim eyes scanning the sealed compartment with the calm assessment of someone who had survived worse. "The air recyclers are failing," Eli said quietly. He could hear it. The fans were stuttering, cycling up and cycling down in an uneven rhythm that told him the power supply was damaged. He pressed his hand against the wall. It was warm, too warm. "And there is a plasma conduit behind this wall that is leaking." Zet made a sound like a small animal dying. "How long?" Eli did the math in his head. Failing air, rising radiation, sealed compartment with no ventilation. 6 hours, maybe less. The other passengers were starting to figure this out too. A Bravani trade delegate was already at the emergency communication panel, hammering the button and screaming for rescue. A group of 3 Torvali soldiers had positioned themselves near the sealed bulkhead, as if they could force it open through sheer intimidation. The comm crackled. Captain Torvalis's voice came through, cold and clicking in the insectoid way of the Valori. "All compartments. This is the bridge. Rescue teams are being deployed according to Galactic Cooperative Emergency Protocol 7. Remain calm. Priorities will be assigned by species status classification." Species status classification. Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. He knew what that meant. Protocol 7 was the Cooperative's emergency triage system, and it ranked species by their political and military value. Valori were near the top. Bravani were in the upper middle. Torvali soldiers had military priority. And a Draconeth exile with no clan affiliation was not on the list at all. The Bravani delegate was already shouting into the comm, demanding priority rescue for himself and his cargo. One of the Torvali soldiers shoved a Kolvari family out of the way to get closer to the door. A small furry Relkon was crying in the corner, ignored by everyone. Eli watched all of this for about 30 seconds. Then he turned away from the arguing and walked to the far wall. He pulled open a maintenance panel and stuck his head inside. "What are you doing?" Zet asked from behind him. "Looking." "Looking for what?" Eli did not answer. He was tracing the lines of the ship's internal structure with his eyes. Conduits, wiring, support beams, the skeleton of the wandering cradle laid bare behind the panel. He had studied the schematics of this class of ship years ago, back when he first started working deep space maintenance. The knowledge was old, but it was still there, buried in the back of his mind like a tool he had not used in a while. "There is an auxiliary maintenance shaft 2 decks above us," he said. "If I can reroute the plasma conduit, bleed the pressure upward instead of letting it build against this wall, I can force open the shaft junction from inside. It would give us a way out that bypasses the sealed bulkheads." Zet blinked all 4 of his eyes. "You can do that?" "Maybe. Maybe is not very comforting, Eli. The plasma conduit housing runs behind this wall and up through a vertical channel to the junction point. Someone would have to crawl inside the housing to manually reroute the flow valves." He paused. "It is going to be very hot in there." "How hot?" 900 degrees. Probably more. Zet stared at him. "That will kill you. It will definitely hurt. That will kill you." Eli pulled his head out of the maintenance panel. He looked around the compartment, at the arguing passengers, the crying Relkan, the Kolvari family huddled on the floor. Zet, with his wide, frightened eyes. He looked at Saratha, who was watching him from her seat with an expression he still could not read. Nobody else was going to do anything. The people with power were fighting over who got saved first. The people without power were waiting to die. Eli opened his toolkit. He pulled out a roll of emergency heat shielding tape and began wrapping it around his forearms. He soaked 2 rags in coolant fluid from a leaking pipe and wrapped them around his hands over the medical tape that was already there. It was not much. It was all he had. Zet was pulling on his arm. Please do not do this. Please. We can wait for rescue. Rescue is not coming for us, Zet. You know that. Then we wait longer. 6 hours, and this room is a coffin. Saratha's voice cut through the noise. It was deep and rough, like gravel being crushed. Human. Eli looked up. You will die in there, she said. He met her eyes, those dim, tired embers that had once burned bright enough to command fleets. He did not look away. Maybe, he said, but if I do not go, everyone in here definitely does. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he turned, climbed into the maintenance panel, and pulled himself into the plasma conduit housing. The hatch sealed behind him. The temperature gauge on the outside of the housing read 912 degrees. It was climbing. Zet pressed his forehead against the wall and closed his eyes. In her seat, Saratha Kelvane stared at the sealed hatch, her claws dug into the armrests. Something old and almost forgotten stirred in her chest. Something that felt like fire, but warmer. On the other side of that wall, a small human with burned hands and a wrench was crawling toward hell. Not for glory, not for status, not because anyone asked him to. Just because it was the right thing to do. The heat hit him like a wall. Eli had worked in hot places before. He had spent 12-hour shifts in engine rooms, where the air shimmered and sweat evaporated off your skin before it could drip. He had crawled through steam tunnels and welded pipes in spaces where the temperature made his vision blur. This was different. This was not heat. This was fire without flame, a living, crushing pressure that squeezed the air from his lungs and turned every breath into a punishment. The plasma conduit housing was barely wide enough for his shoulders. The walls glowed a dull, angry red. His emergency heat shielding tape began to blacken within the first 30 seconds. He kept crawling. The conduit ran horizontally for about 20 meters before angling upward toward the vertical shaft. Every meter felt like a mile. Eli moved on his elbows and knees, dragging his toolkit behind him, feeling the heat press through his wrappings and into his skin. The coolant-soaked rags on his hands were already drying. He could smell them starting to burn. He talked to himself. It was the only thing that kept his mind working. Socket wrench, adjustable spanner, torque driver, plasma cutter. Do not have a plasma cutter. Never have a plasma cutter when you need one. His voice was a dry rasp. The heat was stealing the moisture from his throat with every word. But the words gave him something to focus on, something other than the pain that was building in his hands and arms, like a slow rising tide. He reached the first junction valve. It was a heavy wheel set into the conduit wall, designed to be turned by maintenance robots, not human hands. He grabbed it and pulled. It did not move. The heat had expanded the metal and fused the threads. He wrapped both hands around it, planted his feet against the opposite wall, and pulled with everything he had. Nothing. He pulled again. His arms shook. His burned hands screamed. Nothing. He stopped. He breathed. The air tasted like metal and fire. Fine, he whispered. We do this the hard way. He pulled the wrench from his toolkit and a length of wire he always carried. He looped the wire around the valve handle, threaded it through a gap in the conduit frame to create a fulcrum, and began hammering the other end with the wrench. Each strike sent a shock through his arms. Each strike moved the valve a fraction of a degree. He hit it again, and again, and again. Back in the sealed compartment, things were getting worse. The air was thicker now. The passengers could feel it, a heaviness in their lungs, a warmth that was not just uncomfortable, but dangerous. The Bravani delegate had stopped screaming into the comm. The rescue teams had responded once, telling them to wait. That was 20 minutes ago. The 3 Torvali soldiers had decided they were done waiting. "We take the comm panel," the largest one said. His compound eyes reflected the red emergency lighting like dozens of tiny fires. "We call for military extraction. Our people first." He reached for the emergency panel. A Kolvari father who had been standing nearby, trying to keep his family close to the only source of fresh air left, was shoved hard to the ground. His children scattered, squeaking in fear. Zet rushed forward to help, but was pushed aside with a casual sweep of a Torvali arm. "Move, amphibian!" Zet hit the floor. His toolkit scattered. He looked up at the soldier standing over him and saw nothing in those compound eyes that cared whether he lived or died. Then a shadow fell over all of them. Saratha stood up. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. She simply rose from her seat with the slow, deliberate weight of a mountain deciding to move. She was 8 feet tall. Her scales were cracked and dull. Her body was thin and weakened. But when she stood, something changed in the room. The air itself seemed to shift. She walked to the space between the soldiers and the rest of the passengers. She planted her feet. She crossed her arms. And she looked down at the Torvali with eyes that had suddenly remembered how to burn. "Sit down," she said. The lead soldier stared up at her. "You have no authority here, exile. You have no clan. You are nothing." "I am Saratha Kelvane," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled every corner of the compartment. "Flame commander of the Obsidian Wing. I held the line at Korath then, when 3 fleets broke against our formation. I burned a path through the siege of Delvari that is still taught in your military academies. I was exiled because I refused to follow an order to destroy a civilian colony of 40,000 innocent people." She paused. The silence was total. "I was not exiled for weakness," she said. "I was exiled for conscience. Now sit down before I remind you what a Draconeth looks like when she stops being patient." The soldiers sat down. Nobody else moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the failing air recyclers and the distant groan of the wounded ship. Saratha remained standing, a wall of cracked obsidian between the strong and the weak. She did not threaten again. She did not need to. She looked at Jet, who was still on the floor. "Are you hurt?" "Only my dignity," Jet said in a small voice. "That heals," she said. Then she looked at the sealed hatch where Eli had entered the conduit. Smoke was beginning to seep through the edges of the metal. Deep in the conduit, Eli reached the second junction. His hands were not working properly anymore. The heat-shielding tape had burned away completely. The coolant rags were gone, just ash and memory. His skin was blistered from fingers to elbows, and in some places, the blisters had burst. He could not feel his left thumb. He chose not to think about why. The second valve was worse than the first. It was not just stuck, it was welded shut by years of heat and neglect. The maintenance robots that should have serviced this section had probably not visited in a decade. Budget cuts, ignored maintenance schedules. The same story on every aging ship in the cooperative. Eli stared at the fused valve. He had a wrench, he had wire. He had 2 hands that were rapidly becoming useless. He started hammering. Each strike was agony. He stopped counting after 30. He stopped thinking after 50. His world narrowed to a single point. The valve, the wrench, the next swing. Old songs from Earth drifted through his mind. He could not remember the words, only the melodies, humming in his skull like ghosts. The valve turned. 1 degree, 2, 5, 10. It opened. Plasma pressure redirected. He felt it immediately. The conduit around him cooled by a fraction. Not much, not enough. But the flow was moving upward now, toward the auxiliary shaft junction. If he could reach the final release point and open it, the shaft would blow clear and the path would open. He crawled forward. His vision was going dark at the edges. His body was telling him to stop, to lie down, to sleep. He told his body to shut up. He reached the final junction. His hands found the release lever. He pulled. It held. He wrapped the wire around it. He swung the wrench. The lever broke free. Somewhere above him, metal screamed as the auxiliary shaft blew open. Then his arms gave out. The wrench fell from his fingers. His face pressed against the hot metal of the conduit floor, and everything went dark. Back in the compartment, a ceiling panel groaned, buckled, and burst open. Cool air flooded into the room like water into a desert. Passengers gasped and stumbled toward it. Zet screamed with relief. "He did it," Zet shouted. "He actually did it. The shaft is open. We can climb out." People began moving immediately, lifting children, helping the injured, scrambling toward the opening in the ceiling. But Saratha did not move. She was staring at the conduit hatch. Minutes had passed. The smoke was thicker now. Eli had not come back. She walked to the hatch. She pressed her hand against it. The metal was hot enough to burn any other species on contact. Against her draconet scales, it felt like a warm bath. She tore the hatch open with her bare claws, ripping the metal like paper. Heat and smoke billowed out. She did not hesitate. She folded her massive body and crawled into the conduit. He was unconscious, face down. His hands still curled around the wrench, like he had refused to let go, even after his body quit. His skin was burned badly. Hands, arms, parts of his neck and face. His breathing was shallow and weak. Saratha gathered him up. He was so small in her arms, so light, so impossibly, stubbornly alive. The compartment was almost empty when Saratha climbed out of the conduit with Eli in her arms. Most of the passengers had already escaped through the open maintenance shaft, pulling themselves up to the safer decks above, with the desperate energy of people who had just been given back their lives. Zet had not left. He stood at the base of the shaft, all four arms reaching upward to help a Kalvari child climb to safety. When he turned and saw Saratha emerge from the smoking hatch carrying Eli's limp body, he made a sound that was somewhere between a cry and a prayer. "Is he alive?" "Yes," Saratha said. "Barely." She laid him down on the floor. His hands were the worst, blackened and raw, the skin split in places where the blisters had burst and been burned again. His forearms were not much better. His breathing was shallow, each inhale a thin whistle that suggested his lungs had taken damage from the heat. But his heart was beating. His chest rose and fell. "We need to get him to the medical bay," Zet said. He was already trying to lift Eli, but the human was larger than him, and Zet's arms, though 4 in number, were not built for heavy lifting. Saratha picked Eli up again without a word. She carried him to the maintenance shaft, looked up at the 2-deck climb, and began ascending with one arm, while holding the unconscious mechanic against her chest with the other. Her claws dug into the metal walls of the shaft like they were made of soft clay. She climbed without stopping, without slowing, without making a single sound of effort. Zet scrambled up behind her, struggling to keep pace. When they reached the upper deck, the corridor was crowded with rescued passengers and emergency workers. A medical team was treating a group of Pravani merchants for minor injuries nearby. Saratha walked straight toward them. "This human needs treatment now." The lead medical officer, a Vailori with delicate insectoid features and quick, clicking mandibles, looked up from the Bravani merchant he was treating. His compound eyes moved from Saratha to Eli to a datapad in his hand. "Protocol 7 is in effect," he said. "Species status triage. Humans are Category 5. He will be treated after all higher priority patients have been processed." He just crawled through a plasma conduit to save 40 passengers. He has 3rd-degree burns on 70% of his hands and arms. His lungs may be damaged. "I understand. Protocol 7 does not account for individual actions. It prioritizes by species classification. Saratha set Eli down on the nearest medical cot. Then she straightened to her full 8 feet of height and looked down at the Vylori medical officer. She simply stood there, cracked obsidian scales and dim ember eyes, and waited. The medical officer looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Eli. Then he put down his datapad and began treating the human without another word. Some arguments do not need words. The news of what happened spread through the wandering cradle like fire through dry grass. The 40 passengers who had been trapped in the sealed compartment told the story to anyone who would listen, and many people listened. By the time the ship's emergency repairs were complete and the wandering cradle limped toward the nearest station, almost everyone on board knew the name Eli Voss. The details changed as the story passed from species to species. Some versions said Eli had fought through the conduit bare-handed. Others said he had rewired the entire plasma system single-handedly. One version, told by an excitable Relcan, claimed he had punched through a steel wall. But the core of the story stayed the same in every version. A human mechanic, low status and unremarkable, had given his seat to a stranger, and then nearly died to save a room full of people who would never have done the same for him. The Bravani merchant, the same one who had pulled his cargo close to block Saratha from sitting down in the transit deck, left a crate of high-grade medical salve outside the medical bay door during the night cycle. He did not leave his name. Eli was unconscious for 2 days. His hands were wrapped in regenerative casts, a technology that would rebuild the damaged tissue over several weeks, but could not speed the process. The ship's medical officer, after treating him, had admitted quietly to Zet that he had never seen burn injuries quite like Eli's. Not because they were the worst he had treated, but because the patterns showed that Eli had continued using his hands long after the pain should have made it impossible. The burns were deepest on his palms and fingers, the places where he had gripped the wrench and the valve and the lever. He had held on when every nerve in his body was telling him to let go. Saratha did not leave the corridor outside the medical bay for those 2 days. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her injured legs stretched out in front of her, her eyes closed, but not sleeping. The medical staff walked around her. Nobody asked her to move. Zet brought her water on the 2nd day. She accepted it without comment. "Why are you still here?" he asked. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her, his small body dwarfed by her massive frame. "You do not owe him anything. He gave you a seat. You pulled him out of the conduit. If anything, you are even." Saratha was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer than Jet had ever heard it. "Among my people, when someone saves your life, you owe them a debt of fire. It is a formal thing, recorded, witnessed, eventually repaid through service or sacrifice. It is clean and simple." She paused. "But he did not save my life. He showed me kindness when he had no reason to. He looked at me, a broken exile, a disgraced Draconeth with cracked scales and no clan. And he saw a person who was tired. And then he stood up. And then, hours later, he crawled through fire for 40 strangers, most of whom had never shown him a moment of respect." She looked at Jet. Her ember eyes were brighter than he had seen them before. "That is not a debt," she said. "That is something I do not have a word for." Jet did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They sat together in the corridor and waited. On the morning of the 3rd day, Eli woke up. He opened his eyes slowly, blinked at the ceiling of the medical bay, and spent a long moment trying to figure out where he was. His hands were heavy and numb inside the regenerative casts. His chest hurt when he breathed. His throat felt like he had swallowed sand. Zet was at his bedside in an instant, all 4 arms fluttering. "You are awake. Oh, thank the deep waters you are awake. Do not move. Do not try to move. You are burned and broken, and you are staying in that bed if I have to sit on you." "Did everyone get out?" Eli's voice was a dry whisper. "Yes, all 40, every single one." Eli closed his eyes and let out a breath. "Good. Good. Good. You almost died." "Did anyone fix the coolant relay on Deck 7 while I was out? It was making a weird noise before all this happened." Zet stared at him. It was a wet, hiccuping laugh that turned into something close to crying, and he pressed all 4 hands against his face and shook. Eli watched him with a confused, exhausted expression that made it clear he had no idea why his friend was so emotional about a coolant relay. The door to the medical bay opened. Saratha ducked through the frame and straightened inside. She filled the small room the way a bonfire fills a dark cave, not aggressively, but completely. She looked at Eli. He looked at her. Then she bowed her head. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered her chin to her chest in a gesture so old and so sacred that the last time a Draconeth had offered it to a non-Draconeth, the species in question no longer existed. The bow meant, "I see you. I honor you. You are worthy." Eli, who knew nothing about Draconeth customs and had never studied their culture beyond knowing they were big, scary, and breathed fire, looked at her and said, "Thanks for pulling me out." Saratha raised her head, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the corners of her mouth moved upward. It was not quite a smile. Draconeth faces were not built for smiling, but it was close. "You are welcome, mechanic," she said. 6 months passed. The galaxy moved on. Ships flew, stars burned, planets turned, and Eli Voss went back to work. He had a new ship now, the DSV Iron Vow, a heavy freight hauler running supply lines between the outer colonies. It was older than the Wandering Cradle, and in worse condition, which meant there was always something that needed fixing. Eli liked that. Broken things made sense to him. You looked at what was wrong, you figured out why, and you fixed it. Simple. His hands had healed. The regenerative casts had done their job, rebuilding the burned tissue over weeks of slow, itching recovery. But the scars remained. A web of pale, tight skin across his palms and fingers that would never fully go away. He could still grip a wrench. He could still feel the vibrations in a ship's hull that told him something was about to break. That was all he needed. The little Kolvari had followed Eli to the Iron Vow without being asked, and Eli had not objected. They worked the same shifts, ate the same terrible food in the same cramped mess hall, and fell asleep in the same shared quarters where Zet's snoring sounded like a small engine with a bad valve. Eli did not talk about what had happened on the Wandering Cradle. When new crew members asked about his scars, he said he had burned his hands on a coolant relay, which was technically true, if you left out most of the details. Zet, on the other hand, told the story to anyone who would listen. He told it to the engineering crew. He told it to the cooks. He told it to a confused Bravani cargo inspector who had only asked where the bathroom was. The story grew a little with each telling, but Zet always kept the core honest. He just stood up, Zet would say, all 4 arms spread wide for emphasis. He just stood up and gave her his seat. Like it was the easiest thing in the world. 3,000 light-years away, in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Cooperative, something much larger was in motion. A coalition of elder species, led by the Veilori and supported by the Bravani Trade Federation, had introduced a formal motion to downgrade humanity's membership status in the cooperative. The argument was simple and brutal. Humans were too new, too small, too politically insignificant to justify their current standing. They contributed little to cooperative defense. They held no major trade routes. Their technology was borrowed, not invented. Reducing their status would free up resource allocations for more established species. The vote was scheduled for the end of the week. The human delegation, a small team of diplomats who looked exhausted and outmatched, had argued against the motion for days. But the numbers were not in their favor. The elder species had the votes. Then, on the morning of the vote, the doors of the Grand Assembly opened and a figure walked in that made every representative in the hall stop talking. Saratha Kelvane was no longer the broken exile who had limped onto the transit deck of the Wandering Cradle. Her scales had healed, deep black and gleaming like polished volcanic glass. Her eyes burned with a steady amber fire. She wore the formal armor of the Draconeth Dominion, and on her shoulder was the insignia of the Obsidian Wing, the same unit she had been stripped of 2 years ago. She was not alone. Behind her walked a delegation of 12 Draconeth warriors in full ceremonial armor, each one representing a major clan of the Dominion. The assembly fell silent. In the 6 months since the Wandering Cradle, Saratha's story had traveled far. It had reached the Draconeth homeworld through a chain of retellings. From the rescued passengers to a Bravani news service to a Draconeth merchant who carried it home like a flame cupped in her hands. The story of a human who had shown kindness to a disgraced Draconeth and then crawled through fire for strangers had moved through the Dominion like a slow earthquake. The Draconeth elders had listened, they had debated, and then they had done 2 things. First, they reinstated Saratha Kelvane as Flame Commander, recognizing that her exile had been unjust, and that her refusal to destroy a civilian colony had been an act of honor, not betrayal. Second, they sent her to the Galactic Cooperative with full authority to speak for the Dominion. Because the Draconeth had decided it was time to say something about humans. She looked out over the assembly. Hundreds of representatives from dozens of species, filling the vast circular hall like a living galaxy. The Vylori delegation sat rigid and still. The human diplomats looked confused and hopeful and afraid, all at the same time. Saratha did not argue politics. She did not cite trade statistics or military contributions or resource allocations. She told a story. She told them about a crowded transit deck on an aging ship. She told them about a tired mechanic with burned hands who stood up from the only seat he had so that a stranger could sit down. She told them about a sealed compartment and a leaking plasma conduit, and 40 passengers who were waiting to die while the powerful argued over who deserved to be saved first. She told them about a man who wrapped his hands in rags and crawled into 900 degrees of heat, because he could not sit still while people were in danger. She told them he did not do it for recognition. He did not do it for reward. He did not do it because someone ordered him to, or because protocol demanded it. He did it because a room full of strangers was going to die, and he had 2 hands and a wrench and the stubborn belief that doing nothing was not an option. Then she looked at the assembly and asked one question. Which of your species would have done the same? The silence that followed was the loudest sound the Grand Assembly had ever heard. It stretched across the hall like a held breath, filling every corner, pressing against every representative who suddenly found that they could not meet the Draconeth's burning eyes. Nobody answered. Saratha let the silence hold for 10 full seconds. Then she spoke again. The Draconeth Dominion formally sponsors humanity for protected ally status within the Galactic Cooperative. This grants them full membership rights and the military protection of the Draconeth fleet. Any motion to reduce their standing will be treated by the Dominion as a hostile action against a Draconeth ally. The Elder Species Coalition collapsed in the space of a single heartbeat. The Vylori delegation withdrew their motion before the vote could even be called. The Bravani Trade Federation quietly distanced itself from the whole affair. The human diplomats sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. 3,000 light-years away, on the DSV Iron Vow, Eli Voss was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning water recycler on Deck 12, when Zet came sprinting down the corridor. The Kolvari was making sounds that were not entirely words. His forearms were waving so fast they were a blur. He skidded to a stop next to Eli, grabbed his sleeve, and started talking at a speed that made his translator implant glitch. Eli, dragons, assembly, vote, you, famous, they, protected ally, Saratha, speech, everyone, you, Zet. Eli pulled his arm out of the recycler. Slow down, use sentences. It took Zet 3 attempts to explain what had happened. When he finally finished, Eli stared at him for a long moment. He blinked. He looked down at the open recycler. He looked back at Zet. That is nice, he said. Hand me the 9mm socket wrench. Zet opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then he handed Eli the wrench and sat down on the floor and laughed until his sides hurt. 3 weeks later, a package arrived for Eli on the Iron Vow. It came in a Draconeth diplomatic courier case, a sleek black container marked with the seal of the Obsidian Wing. The ship's mail officer handled it like it was made of glass. Eli opened it in his quarters. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a single scale. It was black and polished and caught the light like a dark jewel. It was mounted on a thin chain of Draconeth steel, the kind of metal that was forged in the heart of a volcano and could withstand temperatures that would melt most alloys to liquid. Zet, looking over his shoulder, gasped. His 4 hands flew to his mouth. Do you know what that is? He whispered. A scale on a chain? That is a Draconeth fire scale, one of her own. She shed it and polished it and mounted it for you. It is the highest personal honor one Draconeth warrior can give to another. It means, he paused, searching for the right words. It means you are firekin. You are remembered. You are theirs. Eli held the scale up to the light. It was warm to the touch, as if some ember of Draconeth fire still lived inside it. He turned it slowly, watching the light move across its surface. There was no note inside the case. No letter. No message. There did not need to be. Eli put the chain around his neck and tucked the scale under his shirt, where it rested against his chest, warm and steady. Then he picked up his wrench, walked back to Deck 12, and finished fixing the water recycler. The galaxy had always measured worth in size, in the fire you could breathe, the fleets you could command, the empires you could build. It ranked its species like products on a shelf, assigning value based on power and age and political weight. And by those measurements, Eli Voss was nothing. A small human on a small ship with scarred hands and oil-stained coveralls, and a stubbornness that bordered on something holy. But he had proven something that the elder species had forgotten a long time ago. Something that should not have been revolutionary, but was. That the smallest gesture, offered freely, with no expectation of return, could move the stars themselves. And that was the most human thing of all.